Edward Carter thought he was in control of everything, but one reckless bet turned his world upside down. What started as a simple challenge became something much bigger, something he never expected. Watch until the end to see how one decision changed everything. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment. Do you think people can truly change? Edward Carter stood at the balcony of his penthouse, whiskey glass in hand, overlooking the vast Manhattan skyline. He had built this city, or at least that's how it felt. Every skyscraper, every major deal, every move of power had his influence embedded in it. At 43, he had achieved what most men could only dream of. A self-made billionaire, CEO of Carter Enterprises, a man who controlled his world with ruthless precision. Everything was a game, and he never lost. Inside, the evening's cocktail party was in full swing. New York's elite moved through the grand space, exchanging calculated smiles, their laughter blending with the sound of clinking champagne glasses. Edward maneuvered through the room with the ease of a seasoned player. He didn't need to force his presence. People naturally gravitated toward him, eager to align themselves with his success. It was a world he had mastered, one where power was measured in influence, manipulation, and staying 2 steps ahead. Then came Marcus Whitman. A longtime friend and occasional rival intercepted him at the bar, swirling a glass of scotch with a smirk that hinted at mischief. Marcus had always been the one to stir the pot, to challenge Edward in ways that others wouldn't dare. Still the same Carter, Marcus mused, tilting his head, always in control, always winning. Edward arched a brow. Would you expect anything less? Marcus chuckled, setting his drink down. Not at all. But doesn't it ever get boring? The same parties, the same faces, the same predictable victories? Edward took a slow sip of whiskey, considering. Why change something that works? Marcus leaned in slightly, lowering his voice just enough to make it feel like a conspiracy. Because you've built walls so high no one can ever surprise you. Don't you ever crave a real challenge? Edward tilted his head, intrigued but cautious. And what exactly do you propose? Marcus's grin widened. A bet. Something to shake things up. You've mastered business, but what about something unpredictable? Something beyond your control? Edward smirked. There's no such thing. Oh, I think there is, Marcus countered. You always go for the same type. Young, sophisticated, polished women who fit perfectly into your world. What if I told you to marry someone who is the complete opposite? Someone you can't mold or dominate. The smirk didn't waver, but there was a flicker of interest in Edward's eyes. Define opposite. Someone who doesn't fit your mold. Someone unconventional by your standards. And here's the catch. You have to stay married for 6 months. No loopholes, no escape. Edward studied Marcus for a long moment. He knew him well enough to understand that this wasn't just a casual suggestion. Marcus had chosen his words carefully, baiting him with the very thing he could never resist, a challenge. And what's in it for me? Edward asked, his curiosity piqued. Marcus's grin turned sharp. $50 million. Straight into Carter Enterprises, no strings attached. But if you fail, if you walk away before 6 months, your reputation as the man who always wins takes a serious hit. Everyone will know you lost. The idea was absurd, completely irrational, and yet that absurdity was what made it intriguing. Edward lived for competition, for proving that he could master any situation. A marriage, even one designed as a test, was just another game to win. You're on, he said, setting his glass down with finality. The conversation shifted, but the bet lingered in Edward's mind long after the party ended. It wasn't just about the money or the reputation. It was the challenge, a game unlike any other. Over the next few days, Edward set his team into motion. Discreetly, they compiled a list of potential candidates, women who were far removed from his world yet fit the criteria Marcus had laid out. His assistant, Samantha, presented him with profiles, backgrounds, photographs, and brief summaries of their lives. Each name and face was nothing more than another business deal to negotiate. Then he saw them. Serafina and Samira Jones. They were striking, not in the refined, polished way of the women he usually surrounded himself with, but in a way that immediately defied his expectations. 36-year-old twin sisters, both with full, curvaceous figures, both deeply involved in social work. They ran a struggling nonprofit, Rise Up, dedicated to helping underserved communities. They had no ties to high society, no interest in luxury, and a reputation for being fiercely independent. Perfect. Edward wasted no time arranging a meeting under the pretense of discussing a potential partnership. The invitation was sent, and within 2 days they arrived at his office. They were different from the women he was used to in every possible way. There was no nervous hesitation, no awe at the towering Carter Enterprises building. They carried themselves with quiet confidence, their natural curls framing faces that were warm yet unyielding. "Mr. Carter," Serafina greeted first, extending a hand. "Thank you for reaching out. We weren't expecting a man of your stature to take an interest in our work." Edward smiled, masking his true intentions. "I believe in supporting meaningful causes." The meeting proceeded with the sisters explaining their nonprofit's mission, detailing the struggles they faced in securing funding. Edward listened, feigning interest while mentally calculating how best to present his proposition. As the conversation neared its end, he leaned forward, his tone shifting to quiet authority. "I have a proposal for you, one that could provide your organization with the resources it desperately needs." Samira's eyes narrowed slightly. "What kind of proposal?" Edward smiled, carefully omitting the true nature of his bet. "Marry me. Both of you?" The room fell into stunned silence. Serafina was the first to recover. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," Edward said smoothly. "A 6-month arrangement. I provide full financial backing for Rise Up. No limitations, no restrictions. In return, you agree to a public marriage. A partnership, nothing more." Samira's skepticism was palpable. And why exactly would a billionaire need to marry 2 social workers? Edward kept his expression unreadable. "Because it benefits both of us. You need funding. I need to show that I'm committed to real social change. It's mutually beneficial." Serafina looked at her sister, her expression cautious. "We'd need time to think about it." Edward nodded, knowing he had already planted the seed. "Take all the time you need, but understand this. Opportunities like this don't come often." As the sisters left his office, Edward felt the familiar surge of satisfaction. The pieces were falling into place. Soon, the game would begin. Little did he know, this was a challenge he wasn't prepared for. The marriage took place with no grand ceremony, no lavish decorations, just a swift and efficient legal process. Edward had arranged everything to be as impersonal as possible, as if closing another business deal rather than entering a marriage. The courthouse setting was cold and bureaucratic, the officiant reading out the necessary statements without emotion. There were no guests, no family, no celebration. Serafina and Samira stood side by side, their expressions unreadable, while Edward remained composed as always. He recited his vows with calculated precision, his voice devoid of sentiment. The sisters, when it was their turn to speak, mirrored his tone, firm but detached. There was no pretense of affection, no illusion of romance, only an understanding that this was a transaction, a mutually beneficial arrangement that neither of them had chosen willingly. When the officiant finally declared them legally married, there was no applause, only an overwhelming sense of finality. The media had wasted no time in sensationalizing the event. Billionaire Edward Carter marries social workers in shocking move. The headlines questioned everything: his motives, their involvement, whether this was a PR stunt or something darker. Commentators speculated about hidden agendas, questioning why two women from a struggling nonprofit would agree to such an arrangement. Some accused the sisters of being gold diggers, while others painted Edward as a man attempting to buy morality through marriage. Neither side could escape the scrutiny. The ride to Edward's penthouse was silent. The tension between them was palpable, a mixture of unease and resignation. As the black luxury car pulled up to the towering glass structure, Serafina and Samira exchanged a glance, their uncertainty mirrored in each other's expressions. This was the world they had been thrust into, one of wealth, power, and control, a world neither of them wanted any part of. Edward led them inside, gesturing vaguely around the penthouse. "This is your home now," he said, his voice devoid of warmth. "You have access to everything you need. If there's anything specific you require, tell my assistant." Samira folded her arms, her gaze sharp. "We won't be your accessories," she said. "We'll play our part in public, but don't expect us to be part of your world behind closed doors." Edward smirked, unbothered. "I wouldn't expect anything else." Serafina stepped forward, her tone more measured. "We'll need separate rooms, a space of our own." Edward nodded without hesitation. "Of course. There are multiple guest rooms. Choose whichever you prefer." That was the extent of their first night as a married trio. The sisters retreated to their separate rooms, shutting out the unfamiliar world they had been forced into. Despite the luxury surrounding them, sleep did not come easily. The weight of their decision pressed heavily on them, the knowledge that they had tethered themselves to a man they did not trust in exchange for the survival of their life's work. The following morning, they awoke to find the media frenzy had only escalated. Paparazzi swarmed the building, tabloids running wild with speculation. Serafina and Samira were dissected in articles, their backgrounds scrutinized, their every move analyzed. Some painted them as victims, others as opportunists. Neither label sat well with them. At breakfast, the three of them sat at a sleek dining table, the silence thick with unspoken tension. Samira pushed her plate aside, barely touching the extravagant meal prepared by Edward's personal chef. "Let's get something straight," she said, her tone clipped. "Just because we're legally married doesn't mean we owe you anything beyond the terms of this deal." Edward took a sip of his coffee, unruffled. "I never expected otherwise." Serafina, ever the diplomat, chose her words carefully. "We'll attend the public events as agreed. We'll play the role when necessary. But when we're home, we don't want to be treated as part of your collection." Edward set his cup down, meeting their gazes. "That suits me fine." The days that followed set the tone for their new reality. Publicly, they were a united front. They attended charity events, fundraisers, and high society galas, presenting the image of a philanthropic billionaire and his socially conscious wives. They smiled for the cameras, engaged in polite conversation, and carefully maintained the illusion that their union was built on shared ideals rather than necessity. Behind closed doors, however, their lives remained separate. Edward spent most of his time at Carter Enterprises, running his empire with the same cold efficiency as always. Serafina and Samira, meanwhile, continued their work at Rise Up, now with the financial backing they had been desperate for. The influx of money allowed them to expand their programs, hire additional staff, and provide more aid to the community than ever before. Yet, despite the success of their mission, the discomfort of their marriage never faded. Edward's world was shallow, built on appearances and power plays. The more time the sisters spent around it, the more they resented the people within it. The wealthy socialites at the galas they attended spoke of charity as if it were a trend, something to be indulged in for the sake of reputation rather than genuine goodwill. Serafina, ever patient, tried to navigate these interactions with grace. Samira, however, had little tolerance for the performative nature of it all. She often found herself biting her tongue to keep from calling out the hypocrisy around her. Edward, for the most part, observed their discomfort with amusement. He found their defiance intriguing, though he never let it show. One evening, after yet another gala filled with hollow speeches and self-congratulatory applause, Samira finally snapped. As soon as they stepped into the penthouse, she turned on Edward, her frustration boiling over. "Do you even believe in any of this? Or is it just another way to stroke your ego?" she demanded. Edward raised an eyebrow, removing his cufflinks. "I believe in strategy. I believe in calculated moves that serve a purpose." Samira let out a bitter laugh. "Of course you do, because everything in your life is about control, isn't it? Even us." Serafina placed a calming hand on her sister's arm, but Samira shook it off, her glare fixed on Edward. "You act like you're doing something noble, but the truth is you don't care about these people. You just want the world to think you do." Edward's expression remained unreadable, but there was a flicker of something behind his eyes. "Is that what you think?" Samira's voice was sharp. "I don't think, I know." Edward didn't argue. Instead, he walked to the bar, poured himself a drink, and took a measured sip before speaking again. "Then perhaps you should show me." Serafina frowned. "Show you what?" Edward set his glass down. "What it is you do. The real work, not the speeches, not the events. Take me to Rise Up. Let me see it firsthand." Samira scoffed. "Why? So you can pat yourself on the back for playing philanthropist for a day?" Edward's gaze remained steady. "So I can understand what you've dedicated your lives to. Isn't that what you want?" Serafina studied him carefully, trying to determine whether this was just another calculated move or a genuine offer. It was impossible to tell. But the opportunity was there. If he was willing to step into their world, to see the reality of the people they fought for, maybe, just maybe, he would start to comprehend why this was more than a business transaction. Samira exhaled, her resistance evident. But after a moment she gave a curt nod. "Fine, but don't expect any special treatment." Edward smirked slightly. "I wouldn't dream of it." And just like that, the dynamic shifted. For the first time since their arrangement began, Edward was willingly stepping out of his carefully curated world. What he would find at Rise Up was something he had never encountered before, a world where his name, his money, and his influence meant nothing. A world where power was not measured in wealth, but in the ability to endure. A world he was completely unprepared for. Edward Carter sat in the back of his luxury car, staring out the tinted window as the vehicle maneuvered through streets far removed from the polished world he had constructed for himself. The towering skyscrapers and pristine storefronts of Manhattan faded into cracked sidewalks, run-down apartment buildings, and storefronts covered in graffiti. It wasn't that he had never seen poverty before. He was aware of its existence, of course, but he had never immersed himself in it, never felt its weight pressing against his carefully curated life. He adjusted the cuffs of his suit, masking the unease creeping into his chest. The car came to a slow stop outside a converted warehouse, the once derelict building now serving as the headquarters for Rise Up. A brightly painted mural covered one of its exterior walls, depicting hands lifting each other upward, a symbol of unity and resilience. Edward observed the people moving in and out of the building, mothers with children, young men in worn-out jackets, elderly individuals carrying grocery bags filled with supplies. There was no order, no structure to their movements, just a raw, unfiltered existence that felt foreign to him. Serafina and Samira were already inside. They had left earlier, preferring to make their own way rather than ride in his chauffeured vehicle. Edward stepped out of the car, straightening his jacket, and immediately felt the eyes on him. People noticed his presence. Some glanced at him with curiosity, others with open distrust. He had never been on this side of the city before, and he looked out of place. Too polished, too composed, too much a symbol of the very system that had failed these people. Inside the center, the energy was overwhelming. Volunteers moved swiftly, distributing bags of groceries, organizing donation bins, assisting families filling out paperwork for housing assistance. The air carried the scent of warm food, the distant hum of conversation, the occasional laughter of children playing in a small designated area. It was chaotic yet purposeful, a world Edward had never stepped into, much less attempted to understand. Serafina noticed him first, her expression unreadable as she approached. "Didn't think you'd actually come," she said, folding her arms. Edward arched a brow. "And yet, here I am." Samira appeared at her sister's side, her gaze sharp. "Try not to look so uncomfortable. You might scare the children." Edward smirked slightly. "I'll do my best." Serafina nodded toward the main area of the center. "Since you're here, you might as well make yourself useful. We need volunteers at the food pantry." Edward hesitated for only a second before following her lead. The pantry was a crowded space filled with shelves of canned goods, fresh produce, and non-perishable items. Volunteers worked quickly, packing bags for families in need, checking inventory, coordinating with suppliers. Serafina handed him a clipboard. "We distribute food to over 200 families a week. It's not enough, but it helps." Edward took the clipboard, scanning the lists of names, quantities, and requests. The sheer volume of need was staggering. He had spent years negotiating multi-million-dollar deals, managing assets worth billions. But here he was confronted with a different kind of economy, one where survival depended on the kindness of strangers, where a single bag of groceries meant the difference between hunger and hope. He stepped behind a table where volunteers were packing food, rolling up his sleeves, determined not to let himself appear hesitant. At first, his movements were stiff, mechanical. He wasn't accustomed to manual labor, to the simple act of stacking cans into bags, handing them to waiting individuals, exchanging words with people whose struggles he had never considered beyond numbers on a financial report. Then he started listening. A mother with 2 small children thanked him quietly, her voice laced with exhaustion. "I don't know what we'd do without this place," she said. "It's been hard since my husband lost his job." A young man, no older than 20, accepted his bag with a nod, avoiding eye contact. Serafina whispered beside him, "He's been living in a shelter for the past few months. Lost his apartment after medical bills stacked up." An elderly woman smiled warmly as she reached for her supplies. "You're new," she observed. "Haven't seen you here before." Edward nodded. "First time." She chuckled. "Good. It's about time you saw how the rest of the world lives." He didn't have a response for that. As the hours passed, something began to shift within him. The work was repetitive but grounding, the interactions brief but impactful. He wasn't in control here. He wasn't dictating outcomes or negotiating for profit. He was simply part of something bigger than himself, something he had never truly understood before. At one point, he stepped back, glancing around the center, taking it all in. The volunteers moved with urgency, not for financial gain, but out of a shared sense of duty. The people receiving aid weren't statistics in a report. They were faces, names, lives hanging in precarious balance. He had spent his entire life building walls, surrounding himself with wealth, insulating himself from the realities others faced daily. Here, those walls felt thinner, less impenetrable. Samira watched him from across the room, her expression skeptical. "You look like you've just realized people struggle." Edward exhaled slowly. "Maybe I have." She scoffed. "Don't act like spending a few hours here changes anything. You'll go back to your penthouse, and these people will still be fighting to survive." Edward met her gaze. "I know, but that doesn't mean I should ignore it." Serafina approached, wiping her hands on a rag. "We're closing up soon. If you're serious about understanding what we do, you should come back." Edward considered her words carefully. A week ago, he would have dismissed the idea. Now, he wasn't so sure. That evening, as they left the center, he didn't get into his car right away. Instead, he stood outside, watching as families walked home carrying their groceries, as volunteers lingered, chatting, sharing small moments of warmth despite the weight of their work. Back at the penthouse, he poured himself a drink and sat by the massive windows, staring out at the glittering city. Normally, the view filled him with a sense of satisfaction, of achievement. Tonight, it felt hollow. He thought about the faces he had seen that day, the voices he had heard. He had spent years believing wealth was the only thing that mattered, that power was measured in control. But today, in that crowded center, surrounded by people who had nothing, he had seen a different kind of power, one built on resilience, on community, on the simple act of giving without expecting anything in return. For the first time in a long time, he felt uncertain. The next morning, before heading to his office, he called his driver and gave him a new address. Rise Up. Because for reasons he couldn't yet explain, he wanted to go back. Edward Carter arrived at Rise Up the next morning, dressed more casually than usual. No suit, no tie, just a button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up and a pair of well-fitted slacks. He still looked out of place among the volunteers and the people who came seeking help, but he carried himself differently today. There was no detached arrogance in his posture, no calculated distance in his gaze. He had come not as a benefactor, not as a businessman surveying a project, but as someone who was trying to understand. Serafina noticed him first, pausing in the middle of stacking boxes of canned goods. Her surprise was evident, though she quickly masked it. "Didn't think you'd actually show up again." Edward smirked, though there was no smugness in it. "Figured I should see what a full day here looks like." Samira, who had been sorting donations a few feet away, narrowed her eyes. "So, what, you're volunteering now?" Edward met her gaze evenly. "If you'll have me." She didn't respond immediately, but there was a flicker of something in her expression. Skepticism, irritation, maybe even grudging respect. Finally, she tossed him a pair of work gloves. "Fine, you can start by helping unload the delivery truck out back." Edward caught the gloves and followed her without argument. The next few hours were grueling in a way he wasn't used to. He lifted crates of produce, stacked boxes of non-perishables, carried bags of supplies from one end of the warehouse to another. Sweat beaded on his forehead, and by midday his shirt was sticking uncomfortably to his back. He wasn't accustomed to this kind of labor, but he didn't complain, didn't stop, and most importantly, didn't expect special treatment. The volunteers around him worked with an efficiency born from necessity. They weren't here for profit, weren't driven by the promise of recognition. They worked because they believed in what they were doing, because they knew firsthand what it meant to struggle. And Edward, for the first time in his life, was beginning to see that. During a break, he found himself seated at a folding table with a few volunteers, drinking water and catching his breath. A middle-aged woman named Rosa, who had been organizing clothing donations, looked him over with amusement. "Not what you're used to, huh?" Edward exhaled a quiet laugh. "Not exactly." Rosa studied him for a moment before nodding approvingly. "Good. You needed it." Edward didn't argue. Serafina and Samira approached, each carrying a plate of food from the community kitchen. Serafina placed one in front of him without a word. He glanced at her. "What's this?" "Lunch," she said simply. "Eat." Edward hesitated. He was used to meals prepared by private chefs, meticulously plated and served on fine china. This was different, a simple but hearty dish of rice, beans, and roasted vegetables. Yet, when he took his first bite, he was surprised by how good it was. Samira sat down across from him, watching him closely. "So, what's your plan here?" Edward set his fork down. "What do you mean?" She gestured around the center. "You've already won, right? You got your marriage, your PR boost, everything you needed. So why are you still here?" Edward didn't answer right away. He had asked himself the same question last night, as he sat alone in his penthouse staring at a city that suddenly felt smaller than it ever had before. He could have walked away, could have continued living in the world he knew best, but something about this place, about these people, had unsettled him in a way he couldn't ignore. "I don't know," he admitted finally, "but I want to find out." Serafina exchanged a glance with her sister before nodding slightly. "Then keep showing up." Edward did. Days turned into weeks, and he continued to return, immersing himself in the work. He sorted donations, helped with the after-school tutoring program, assisted in organizing community events. He learned names, listened to stories, met people who had endured more than he could ever fathom. He saw the cracks in the system that people like him had ignored for years, saw how the wealthy viewed charity as a performance rather than a responsibility. At first, the people at Rise Up remained wary of him. They were used to businessmen making empty promises, to politicians visiting for photo ops before disappearing. But Edward didn't leave. He showed up every morning and stayed until late in the evening, doing whatever was needed. Slowly, grudgingly, they began to accept that he wasn't just there to observe. He was there to work. The change in him was subtle but undeniable. He stopped wearing expensive watches, stopped caring about the scuff marks on his shoes. He no longer checked his phone every 5 minutes, no longer viewed time as something that could only be spent making deals. Serafina saw the difference first. She noticed how he no longer carried himself like an outsider, how he asked fewer questions and instead listened more. She saw the way he interacted with the children in the tutoring program, how he knelt beside them to help with their reading assignments, how he laughed when one of them jokingly told him he was bad at math. Samira remained skeptical. She refused to believe a man like Edward Carter could change so easily. Every time she saw him lifting boxes or handing out food, she waited for the moment he would get bored, For the moment, he would realize this wasn't his world and walk away. But he didn't. One evening, as they were closing up the center, Edward found himself alone with Samira in the main office. She was reviewing paperwork, exhaustion evident in her posture. "You should take a break," he said, leaning against the doorway. She didn't look up. "You should mind your business." Edward smirked. "Fair enough." After a pause, she finally met his gaze. "Why are you still here?" Edward considered his answer carefully. "Because for the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm doing something that matters." Samira studied him, searching for deception. When she found none, she sighed, rubbing her temples. "Just don't expect a trophy for it." "I don't," he said quietly. "I just want to help." She didn't respond right away, but something in her expression softened, just slightly. For the first time since this entire arrangement had started, Edward felt like he was no longer playing a game. He wasn't here to win a bet or manipulate a narrative. He was here because he wanted to be. And that realization terrified him more than anything else ever had. Edward Carter stood at the construction site that had once been slated for demolition. Where there were once talks of high-rise developments and luxury complexes, there now stood something entirely different. A future that he had fought for. A future he had chosen to build. The Rise Up Community Center was not just standing, it was thriving. Months had passed since he had outmaneuvered Alan Pierce and the developers, securing the property under his name and personally funding the expansion of Rise Up. It was no longer a cramped warehouse struggling to meet demand. It was now a fully operational facility with additional programs, better infrastructure, and resources that had once seemed impossible. Serafina and Samira had been skeptical at first. They had expected a catch, a clause, something that would reveal that he was still the same Edward Carter who had married them as part of a bet. But time had chipped away at that distrust. He hadn't walked away. He had shown up every single day. Edward no longer attended the community center as an outsider. The people knew his name now, not as a billionaire, not as a man who had once only cared about power, but as someone who had proven through action that he was willing to stand alongside them. As he walked through the center, he saw the faces of those who had once looked at him with suspicion. Mothers who now had stable jobs thanks to the workforce programs. Teenagers who had access to better education. Elderly individuals who now had a place to feel safe. He had spent his life controlling markets and industries, but for the first time, he had invested in something that wasn't just about numbers. It was about people. Serafina stood by the entrance, overseeing a group of volunteers organizing a supply drive. She had been the first to truly see the change in him. She no longer spoke to him as if he were just another businessman playing a game. She spoke to him as someone she respected. Samira, however, had been the last to come around. She had fought against the idea of trusting him, refusing to believe that someone like him could change. But one night, weeks after he had purchased the center, she had found him sitting in the main office, exhausted, reviewing budget reports. Not because he had to, but because he wanted to. "You're really in this," she had said. Edward had simply nodded. "I am." And that was the moment things had shifted. Now, as he stepped onto the newly paved sidewalk outside the center, he saw them both waiting for him. Serafina crossed her arms. "You're late." Edward smirked. "I was busy making money for this place." Samira rolled her eyes. "For once, you're spending it on something that matters." Edward chuckled. "Guess I'm finally learning." They stood in silence for a moment, watching as people moved in and out of the center, as children ran through the courtyard, as volunteers greeted visitors like family. Serafina turned to him. "So, what happens now?" Edward inhaled deeply, looking at the life he had built here, the life he had never expected to want. "I keep showing up," he said simply. Samira studied him for a long moment. Then, finally, for the first time, she smiled. For Edward Carter, there was no grand declaration, no dramatic ending. There was only this, a future he had chosen. Not because he had to, but because he wanted to. And, for the first time in his life, winning didn't matter. What mattered was this. What mattered was them. Edward Carter's journey proves that real change isn't about words. It's about actions. What started as a bet became the most important lesson of his life. Do you believe people can truly change? Let us know in the comments. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe so you never miss our next powerful video.